Every morning, the system opens the same way. The same dashboard, the same structure, the same ordered grid waiting for the day to begin, columns for tasks, deadlines already placed, priorities sorted before the first decision is made. At first, it felt useful. The system simplified things. It removed the small frictions that normally slow a day down. You didn't have to think about what to do first. The structure decided that. You didn't have to reconsider how work should unfold. The sequence already existed. The system stayed consistent, and consistency felt efficient. For a while it seemed harmless. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was just structure, a dashboard, a routine, a calendar that quietly arranged time into neat, predictable blocks. You opened it. You followed it. The day moved forward. Nothing about the process felt controlling. It felt organized. But repetition changes structures. Each time the system repeated, something small narrowed. It wasn't obvious. The dashboard didn't remove possibilities directly. It didn't force you to ignore ideas. It simply made certain paths easier to follow. Tasks that matched the system appeared naturally inside it. Tasks that didn't match the structure felt harder to place. Eventually, those tasks stopped appearing at all, not because they were forbidden, because they were inconvenient. The system stayed, and slowly variation faded. At first, the change was invisible. You still believed you were choosing the structure. You could always adjust the system if you wanted. That possibility remained. But repetition does something unusual to decisions. The more often a structure repeats, the less often it needs to be reconsidered. It becomes background, something stable, something that feels like part of the environment rather than a tool inside it. And when something becomes part of the environment, people stop questioning it. They simply move within it. This is how systems stabilize behavior, not through force, through repetition. The dashboard appears again tomorrow. The same columns, the same sequence of tasks, the same blocks of time already waiting to be filled. It doesn't ask for permission. It simply exists. And because it exists, decisions begin forming around it. Work adapts to the structure. Schedules compress around the grid. Ideas that don't match the format quietly disappear. It doesn't feel restrictive. It feels efficient. That's why it works. Efficiency makes structures feel natural. The system stayed. And over time, something subtle begins to change. The language people use to describe themselves shifts. At first, the system is described as a tool. I use this to organize my work. I built this system to keep things clear. The system is something external, something adjustable, something separate from the person using it. But repetition slowly erodes that separation. After enough time, the language changes. Not, I use this system, but this is just how I work. The difference is small, but the structure has already moved. The system is no longer outside behavior. It has become part of the description of the person. The routine stayed. The structure remained stable. An identity quietly began forming around it. Nothing dramatic happened. No moment of control being lost. Just repetition, the same dashboard, the same structure, the same grid appearing each morning, and each repetition narrowing variation just a little more. It narrowed quietly. The system you opened this morning probably didn't feel unusual. It looked familiar. A calendar, a task manager, a routine that had already been followed many times before. Nothing about it suggested influence. It simply appeared as the structure of the day. That familiarity is important because systems that repeat often enough stop feeling like tools. They feel like normal conditions. A calendar does not feel like a framework shaping behavior. It feels like time. A productivity dashboard does not feel like a structure directing decisions. It feels like work itself. The system disappears into the environment. And when a structure disappears into the environment, people stop noticing how much of their behavior is moving inside it. This happens slowly, one small adjustment at a time. At first, the system organizes tasks. You enter responsibilities into the structure. The dashboard simply holds them. But over time, the direction begins to reverse. Tasks begin adapting to the dashboard. Projects begin adjusting to the calendar. Ideas begin shaping themselves around the available spaces inside the system. The grid stays constant. Behavior adjusts. This adjustment usually happens without resistance because the system makes certain actions easier. A task that fits the dashboard structure moves smoothly through the day. It has a place, a clear sequence, a defined block of time. But an idea that doesn't fit the system feels different. It doesn't have a category. It doesn't match the expected structure. There isn't an obvious place to put it, so the idea waits. Sometimes it disappears entirely, not because the system removed it, because the structure quietly encouraged something else. Repetition amplifies this effect. Every time the system repeats, the same kinds of actions move through it successfully, and successful actions tend to repeat. The system begins selecting behavior indirectly, not by preventing choices, but by making certain choices easier to repeat. This is how reinforcement works, not through commands, through patterns. The actions that pass smoothly through the system appear again tomorrow. The actions that resist the structure appear less often. Eventually, they stop appearing at all. It doesn't feel like restriction. It feels like efficiency. That's why the shift is difficult to notice. The structure is solving problems, reducing friction, making work predictable. The system stays, and stability feels productive. But stability also narrows variation. Every structure creates boundaries. Every grid organizes behavior into certain shapes. And every repeated system quietly encourages behavior to stay inside those shapes. At first, those shapes feel useful. They help organize complexity. But over time, the system becomes the reference point. New decisions begin forming around the structure instead of around the original intention. Work begins matching the grid. Schedules begin matching the calendar. Conversations begin matching the available blocks of time. The structure becomes the silent center of the day. Nothing about it feels imposed because the system was originally created voluntarily. That's the paradox. People trust the systems they design themselves. The structure doesn't feel external. It feels like an extension of their own choices. But repetition changes that relationship. The more often the structure repeats, the more stable it becomes. The more stable it becomes, the less often it gets questioned. Eventually, the system feels permanent, something that simply exists, something that does not require reconsideration. And when something stops being reconsidered, it begins shaping behavior quietly. The system stayed, variation faded, and the person inside the structure rarely notices when the adjustment begins. At first, the relationship between a person and their systems feels simple. You create the structure, you decide how it works, you adjust it when something needs to change. The system exists to serve the person using it. That assumption feels obvious. After all, the dashboard didn't exist before you built it. The calendar didn't arrange itself. The routine began as a choice, so it's natural to believe the system remains under your control. But repetition quietly changes the direction of influence. The first few times a system is used, it behaves like a tool. Flexible, temporary, something that can be rearranged whenever necessary. But systems are designed to reduce friction. They remove small decisions. They organize actions into predictable sequences. They stabilize behavior. That stability is what makes them useful. But stability has a side effect. The more stable a structure becomes, the less often it is reconsidered. The calendar appears again tomorrow. The routine repeats. The dashboard opens with the same structure it had yesterday. Nothing about it requires attention, and when something no longer requires attention, it begins shaping behavior quietly. The shift is subtle. It doesn't arrive as a moment of control being taken away. It appears as a series of small adjustments. You adapt to the system because adapting feels easier than changing it. A task that fits the structure moves forward quickly. A task that doesn't match the system takes more effort. So behavior moves toward the easier path. Again and again. The system stays constant. The person adjusts. At first, the adjustment feels harmless. Maybe a task is rewritten slightly so it fits the dashboard categories. Maybe a meeting moves so it fits the calendar structure. Maybe an idea is postponed because it doesn't match the current workflow. Small changes, reasonable ones, but repetition compounds those adjustments. Each time the structure repeats, behavior becomes slightly more aligned with it. The grid remains fixed. Work begins fitting the grid. The calendar remains structured. Time begins matching the calendar. The system does not change very often, so behavior does. This is where friction begins to appear. Not emotional friction, structural friction, the quiet tension between flexibility and stability. Every system prefers stability. Stability is what makes systems predictable. Predictability is what makes them efficient. But stability also resists variation. A stable structure encourages the same kinds of actions to repeat. Anything outside that pattern feels less natural, less efficient, less compatible with the system itself. And over time, those incompatible actions appear less often. The system did not forbid them. It simply made something else easier. This is the moment where the relationship between person and system begins to invert. The tool that once adapted to behavior now becomes the structure behavior adapts to. But the change happens gradually enough that it rarely feels like influence. It feels like preference. I just work better this way. I like keeping things organized. This system keeps me productive. Those explanations feel reasonable. Because the structure still appears voluntary, you can still change the system if you want. The possibility remains. But repetition makes change less likely. Every successful day inside the system reinforces the structure. Every completed task confirms that the grid works. Every repeated routine strengthens the system's stability, and stability slowly transforms into expectation. The dashboard is no longer just a tool. It becomes the environment where work happens. The calendar is no longer a schedule. It becomes the structure time moves through. And when structures become environments, people begin shaping themselves to move comfortably inside them. The system stayed. The person adjusted. And the difference between those two movements is almost impossible to notice while it's happening. At first, the adjustments between a person and their system are small, almost invisible. A task is rewritten slightly so it fits the dashboard. A meeting moves 10 minutes earlier so it aligns with the calendar. An idea is postponed until a more convenient block of time appears. Nothing about these decisions feels significant. They feel efficient, practical, reasonable. The system simply helps things move smoothly, but repetition compounds small decisions. Each time behavior adjusts to the structure becomes slightly more reinforced. Not because the system demands it, because the adjustment worked. The task moved forward. The day felt organized. The structure appeared successful, and successful structures repeat. That repetition creates a feedback loop. The more often the system produces predictable results, the more reliable it appears. The more reliable it appears, the less often it gets reconsidered. The system becomes stable. Stability is powerful, not because it forces behavior, because it makes change unnecessary. When a structure appears to work, people rarely question it. They simply repeat it, again tomorrow, and the day after that. Each repetition strengthens the same pattern. The same kinds of tasks move easily through the system. The same types of decisions align with the structure. Over time, the system begins filtering behavior indirectly, not by removing options, but by reinforcing certain ones. A task that fits the dashboard structure gets completed quickly. It has a place, a category, a clear path forward. But a task that does not match the structure feels different. It lacks a clear position. It interrupts the established sequence. So it waits. Sometimes it disappears. Not because it was rejected, because the system made other actions easier to repeat. This is how compounding works. Small adjustments accumulate until the structure begins shaping the range of possible behavior. The dashboard still appears neutral. The routine still feels voluntary, but the system now influences which actions repeat and which actions fade. And repetition is one of the most powerful forces shaping behavior. What repeats becomes familiar. What becomes familiar becomes comfortable, and what becomes comfortable begins to feel like preference. This is where the system begins to disappear from awareness. The structure no longer feels like something external. It feels like the natural way things are done. The dashboard is simply how work is organized. The routine is simply how the day begins. The calendar is simply how time moves. The system becomes invisible. But invisible structures still influence behavior. In fact, they influence it more effectively. Because unnoticed systems are rarely questioned. Each repetition strengthens the structure's stability. Each successful day confirms the pattern. The system stayed. Variation narrowed. And gradually the range of actions that comfortably exist inside the structure becomes smaller. The system never needed to force this change. It only needed to repeat long enough for behavior to stabilize around it. This is the quiet power of compounding. A single adjustment means very little, but thousands of small adjustments accumulate until the structure that once organized behavior begins shaping the person inside it. And by the time that shift becomes visible, it no longer feels like influence. It feels like identity. Every structure organizes behavior in a particular way. A calendar divides time. A dashboard divides work. A routine divides the day into predictable sequences. These divisions feel helpful. They simplify complexity. They make decisions easier. But every structure also creates boundaries. Not dramatic ones, quiet ones. A calendar encourages time to move in blocks. Meetings begin at certain moments. Tasks occupy defined spaces. Work appears inside the available structure. Anything outside that structure feels less natural, less compatible, less efficient. The system never says these actions are impossible. It simply makes them harder to repeat. A conversation that does not fit the schedule gets postponed. An idea that does not fit the workflow waits for another time. A project that does not align with the structure becomes difficult to place. The system did not remove these possibilities. It simply made something else easier. And ease determines repetition. The actions that move smoothly through the system appear again tomorrow. The actions that resist the structure appear less often. Over time, those resistant behaviors begin disappearing entirely, not through restriction, through neglect. This is how narrowing occurs. Quietly, gradually, without conflict. The system remains stable. Behavior adapts. The grid stays constant. Work begins matching the grid. The routine stays predictable. Decisions begin matching the routine. The calendar stays structured. Time begins matching the calendar. Every successful day inside the system reinforces the same pattern, the same sequence, the same rhythm, and repetition slowly removes variation. The person inside the system rarely notices this change while it is happening, because nothing feels lost. The system still works. Tasks are completed. Schedules remain organized. The structure appears efficient. Efficiency makes narrowing difficult to see because efficiency always feels productive. But efficiency also reduces exploration. It favors actions that match the existing structure. It discourages actions that do not. This is why narrowing rarely feels like restriction. It feels like optimization. The system becomes better at producing predictable results. Predictable results reinforce the structure, and reinforcement stabilizes behavior. Eventually, the system begins shaping the range of decisions available inside the day. New actions must fit the structure to exist comfortably. Ideas begin adapting themselves before they are even written down. Work begins forming inside the boundaries of the system automatically. The grid remains unchanged. Behavior reshapes itself around it. Over time, the person inside the structure begins describing this pattern as preference. I like keeping things structured. I work best when everything is organized. This system fits how I think. Those explanations feel accurate because the system has repeated long enough to feel natural. But the system did not emerge from personality. Personality adapted to the system. The structure stayed. Variation narrowed. And the change was gradual enough that it rarely felt like influence. When a behavior repeats long enough, something unusual begins to happen. The behavior stops feeling like an action. It begins feeling like a trait. At first, the system exists outside the person. It is something used, something designed, something that organizes work. The relationship is clear. The system is the tool. The person is the one using it. But repetition slowly weakens that boundary. Each time the structure repeats successfully, the behavior inside it feels more natural. The dashboard organizes another day. The routine begins again tomorrow. The calendar fills another week with predictable blocks of time. Nothing about the process feels forced. The system works. That success changes perception. Instead of viewing the structure as something external, people begin interpreting their repeated behavior as personal preference. The explanation shifts. Not, I built this system to organize my work, but I'm the kind of person who works this way. The system disappears. The behavior remains. And the behavior begins defining the person. This is identity drift, not dramatic, not emotional, gradual. A repeated structure becomes familiar. Familiar behavior becomes comfortable. Comfortable behavior becomes preference. And preference becomes identity language. The routine no longer feels like something that organizes the day. It feels like the natural way the day should begin. The dashboard no longer feels like a tool. It feels like the normal structure of work. The calendar no longer feels like a schedule. It feels like the natural movement of time. The system stayed, but the meaning around it changed. People rarely notice this shift because the structure was originally chosen. The system was voluntary. That choice creates trust. The system feels like an extension of the person's intentions, but repetition gradually transfers influence. The more often the system repeats, the more stable it becomes. The more stable it becomes, the more behavior adapts to it. Eventually, the structure no longer needs to be actively maintained. It becomes the environment where decisions happen.